Thank you, Rafael. Well, I guess my turn now. I am going to refer to a case that I believe is relevant, although it's almost lost in time, of a businessman, an immigrant, a very successful Italian immigrant that came to the Americas, lost his fortune in 3 occasions to 3 different separate dictators. In 1935, he was confiscated by Leonidas Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. In 1942, by Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, and then again by Fidel Castro in 1960, which is an interesting story. He also lost twice to almost lost twice his properties and his wealth to natural disasters or social-made disasters. In one occasion to a hurricane in 1930 that passed through the Dominican Republic and destroyed everything that he has built there in his trade, and then again to the Civil War of 1965 in the Dominican Republic. Now, these men that never went to the university, that didn't have an MBA, that was a self-made man, that never, and this is something also interesting for anybody, looking for good principles to apply in business. He never stopped to whine about the disgraces that has happened to him, or, fill his heart with rancor and concentrate in hatred. He simply said, okay, I lost everything, I will stand up again, and I'll fight back again. He was the kind of person that believed that the virtue of man is not measured by the number of times that you fall down, but the number of times that you raise up again. And he certainly did. Now, this person was brutally, his integrity, his reputation was brutally attacked in 3 different occasions in campaigns that were directly or indirectly sponsored by the Cuban state. And that called my attention, because when you have somebody that has died in 1975 and you find that that person have a Facebook with friends such as Mayor Lansky or things like that, you can immediately tell that something fishy is going on. Somebody has appropriated the identity of that person and is doing their best to discredit him. Certainly in 1975, nobody had a Facebook. And that, made me think about the words of one of the main characters in the repression in Russia, still under Lenin, when he declared that when somebody is brought to the police in that time, they were not looking about the individual guilt of the person. They were looking about their class origin, and it was class guilt that they had to pay for. And that was the case of Barletta. I mean, they tried to accuse him of being partners to Trujillo, who actually detained him and tortured him and confiscated all his properties in 1935. They also declared that he was associated to Batista, who confiscated his properties. Barletta won a trial in court that the court declared that the properties had to be returned to him. That was in the 50s, and Batista never returned the properties that were confiscated. And it was obvious that what the government was after at that time was not Amadeo Barletta, was a whole entrepreneurial class. And the same kind of slander of smear campaigns that were used against him and against other businessmen like him at that time were similar to the ones that were used in 1968 in the so-called revolutionary offensive against people who were called parasites, bandits, scum, you name it. Because they had a small cafeteria or they were selling ice cream on a corner. So it was obviously a whole social group that was targeted, and against that social group, that was the reason of these smear campaigns. It didn't matter how much money they had or how much influence they had. They were after a whole social group. One interesting thing is that in this campaign, sometimes the Cuban government have targeted a person because they want to get something out of that person. For example, in 1960, when Barletta was targeted for that campaign, they were after his media empire. He had the most prestigious and important national newspaper in Cuba, El Mundo, and he also had a TV station that broadcasted all throughout the island. At a moment where the government didn't want to look communist yet, but wanted to make sure that they would exert control over the media and information, it was very convenient to accuse this person of having profited from the Batista dictatorship and take over his properties. At that time, the legal umbrella under which the revolutionaries were operating only allow for confiscating the properties of those that were close associates of Batista. So that was the way that they had to make their case. At that time, that was the only way they made their case. Nobody, although they took over his bank accounts, although they went through his books, although they nationalized the offices and the buildings, and they had time enough to carefully look for any sin of these men, they didn't found any, and they just constructed this accusation that he proved wrong, but at that time, nobody was listening, as some people say. But then, in 1971, Barletta's son, Barletita, went to the Sociedad Interamericana de Prensa, the SIP, and denounced the media censorship in Cuba. And apparently somebody got very angry in Havana. They thought that probably this denunciation was very effective. And they went after Barletta again. And they put out a whole editorial page, a full page in Granma that don't have many pages to waste. They dedicated a whole page to Barletta again. In this occasion, 1971, they started to call him mafioso. Well, it's very convenient. He was of Italian origin. And at that time, oh, what a coincidence, Mario Puzo's book on The Godfather was making great sales. So this was a great way of associating one thing with the other. And that was that. I mean, that apparently they count down and they forgot about the man for a few years. Actually, until 1991. What happened then? In 1989, as we all can remember, there was this big scandal about the association to drug trafficking of elements very high up in the Cuban government, and there was a big question mark on the government itself and its relationship with the cartels, like, for example, in Colombia, like the cartel of Cali and Medellin and so on. This was something that had an international impact, but it also had an impact internally. Even in the communist ranks, many people were very upset by discovering that this was taking place. And there was, let's say, an emotional and intellectual need to minimize the impact of these revelations. All of a sudden, a novelist, not a historian, a novelist, was very closely associated to the armed forces in the so-called gray decade of the 1970s. This man was a favorite of the armed forces, and he was in charge of directing the cultural magazine of the armed forces, Revolución y Cultura, when they were prosecuting left and right intellectuals and writers in Cuba. And this man was picked up and was sent to Colombia and was giving apparently he declares it in the book. He said that he was asked by his superior in the magazine of the armed forces to write on the drug trafficking previous 1959 and to prove that whatever has happened in 1989 was little thing, irrelevant in comparison to what was happening before the revolution. So he came up with this revisionist theory of the history of Cuba, in which he said that the prosperity of Cuba in 1958 was due to the participation of the Italian-American mafia in Cuba and the control that it had together with the intelligence community of the United States and Batista in Cuba. Well, let me tell you that, as Carlos Alberto once commented, all the casinos that we see in all these movies and serials in TV of pre-revolutionary Cuba and Havana are not, they cannot even feel or compare to one block in Atlantic City today, or to one block in the Dominican Republic, or to, not to compare to Las Vegas, right? But, and the Cuban economy, to say that the Cuban economy depended on those casinos is really outrageous. The statistics are there. What the Cuban, the Cuban production of sugar, nickel, tobacco, and everything was immense. Tourism, it was the only thing that you could link in a certain way to this group, was still a very minor part of the equation. But then this man constructed this story and involved, he thought that Barletta was an easy target. He was Italian, he was being accused of mafioso before by Granma, the newspaper, so he incorporated Barletta to this novel that he built up to justify what happened in 1989. Well, my conclusion, I went through the National Archives of the United States in Maryland and in Washington. I went through the National Archives in Cuba through a friend that did the research, that had access and did the research. I went through the National Archives in the Dominican Republic. I had access to the private archives of Barletta, thanks to the gracefulness of the family that opened those archives for me. And I went through every possible book on the mafia. I'm not an expert in the mafia yet, but I am getting closer. And I interviewed the three biographers of Mayor Lansky, Santo Traficante Jr., and they all told me that this is total fantasy. And if you talk to a historian of Colombian origin, Rovner, he has a book on the mafia in Cuba before 1959, and he explicitly, and before my research, said several times that all these were fictions, that all these were constructions for political and ideological purposes. So that is what I have found, and this is, I also got access to the Freedom of Information Act of every possible file that the intelligence community may have on Barletta in the United States, and the whole thing proved to be a lie. But that lie has been disseminated virally in the internet, and this is the kind of things that, to advance towards reconciliation, the Cuban government one day would have to admit, the same way that the Soviet Union admitted publicly of the lies that were made about the biological warfare and AIDS of the United States, they would have to admit also of these constructions against Carlos Marquez Sterling, Carlos Alberto Montaner, Barletta, and every other person, including Joanny Sanchez and Antonio Rodiles and the ladies in white nowadays. Thank you.